and Anna became Professor of European Politics at the University of Bristol in 2019. They have 2 children, Lucia and Elizabeth, who are also here tonight. Would you like to give everyone a little wave? There we are.
God, it's so embarrassing.
But back to the academic story. How do you get to the point where you can publish a book on anarchism with one of the premier political science publishers in the world? In the last year of his PhD in Loughborough, Professor Prichard took a teaching role in IR theory at the University of Bath, then became a research associate on an EU Horizon grant looking at EU peace-building strategies in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Then in 2009, he moved to Bristol on his own ESRC postdoctoral research fellowship, where he turned his PhD into a book published by Paul Grave in 2013 with the catchy title Justice, Order and Anarchy, the International Political Theory of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. You might notice the 3rd language he's now got me to pronounce, so we're counting as we go. This is the first full study of Proudhon's international political theory in any language and drew on a decade of study of the primary untranslated works of this unjustifiably maligned 19th century French public intellectual. Following Bristol, Alex became a teaching fellow in international relations at the London School of Economics before taking on a 3-year teaching role at Coventry University that lasted only 3 months. 3 months into the job, Biche, our very own Biche, who I think is here tonight.
She's online.
Hi, Biche online. You're missed. She approached Alex to reapply for the lectureship in IR that he didn't get the year before. Alex's research took a novel direction on arriving in Exeter. This was in no small part down to the fact that Exeter was and remains home to one of the largest and most plural group of political theorists in the UK, a huge draw to a budding theorist. The focus of his work shifted slightly, tackling the history and philosophical underpinning of the concept of anarchy. Across a series of publications, Professor Prichard began to redirect the study, this foundational concept in the history of political thought and IR, and became one of the most recognisable names in the study of anarchy, anarchism, and IR theory. He secured his first large grant as co-I with Ruth Kinner in 2015. This was an ESRC Transforming Social Science Award that uncovered how anarchy acted as constitutional principle or concept that shaped anarchist practice. This grant produced a step change in his research trajectory, and for the last 10 years, he's been working on the recovery of the anarchist constitutional tradition, which he will be sharing with you this evening. In 2022, Professor Prichard published a new edition of Anarchism, a very short introduction in this leading series with Oxford University Press, edited and published a translation of Proudhon's War and Peace, a 2-volume magnum opus that is also the only complete English translation of any of Proudhon's writings. He also published, it was a good year, 2022. He also published Anarchic Agreements, a field guide to collective organising. This last book came out of Alex and Ruth's co-produced work with anarchist communities and was picked up by anarchist organisers, used to help restructure social centres, social enterprises, small and medium-sized companies, and more. The work that went into this book and its uses by activists in Europe and North America was central to the impact case study he submitted in the 2021 ref. In 2023, Alex secured an ISRF mid-career fellowship with Professor Kinner, allowing them to finish writing the book that emerged out of the ESRC grant, which had been delayed by COVID, homeschooling, and other responsibilities. The book manuscript was submitted last week and, with any luck, will be out with Cambridge in their stellar LSE International Study Series next year. Professor Prichard has also been an active and engaged member of the academic community in Exeter. Since 2016, Alex has been an active member of the local union branch, working hard in this role to try and make the university a better place for all of us. He was elected president of the branch in 2022, and then after returning from the ISRF fellowship, was elected co-chair with Michael Flexer, who's also here tonight, I think. Hi, Michael. Alex's head of department, Professor Rob Lamb, commends Alex's citizenship and says in tribute, Alex has brought his characteristic energy and enthusiasm to 2 major roles within his department in recent years. He's served in the demanding Director of Education role for politics during a period characterised by increasing student numbers, as well as the early part of the corona pandemic, when he provided valuable leadership under difficult circumstances, and is now Director of Research in SPSPA, where he brings his creativity, determination and optimism to support colleagues across 6 different disciplines. And Rob Lamb will be proposing a vote of thanks after the lecture. I'd also like to pay tribute as a Deputy PVC and say I've always appreciated your collegiality, and it's always a lot of fun and constructive to work with you, Alex, so thank you. Ongoing. And finally, Alex's father, Mark, is also here tonight in the front row. He's looking a bit alarmed that I've mentioned him. And I know it means the world to Alex that you could make it for this wonderful celebration. Alex has disclosed publicly, I want to make you aware this is not private knowledge, that he turned 50 last Friday. And he's still a bit bleary-eyed, he says, after the party on Saturday, but he assures me he is well prepared for the lecture. So, diolch, Alex, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, I'm just checking to make sure there's nobody waiting. All right, thank you. Gosh, hard to know what's left to say, really, but don't worry, I've got loads to say. All right, so thank you very much, Helen. That was really, really kind of you, and thank you all for coming, and for those of you that have been able to join us online. So, given it's the 5th of November, I thought I'd use that as a segue into what I'm going to talk about later. So, on this day, in 1605, Guy Fawkes, an Englishman, who had just returned from fighting for the Spanish against the Dutch in the 80 Years' War, decided that he'd had enough of King James I, and he and his co-conspirators devised a papist plot to blow up the Houses of Parliament and kill James I. He was, of course, caught red-handed, and he and 8 of his co-conspirators were hung, drawn and quartered on this very day. Oh, very soon afterwards. Very soon afterwards, actually before the end of the year, Parliament enacted the Act of Thanksgiving of 1605. And this stood for 200 years. And what it demanded was that once a year, on the 5th of November, everyone was expected to give thanks to God for protecting James I's life. And it stood until around 1859, when it was repealed. And when it was repealed, there was a little Surrey newspaper stated that had you been in Guildford on the 5th of November 1859, you would, and I quote, have imagined yourself in a country disturbed by anarchy and red republicanism. Now, Guy Fawkes would have been turning in his grave, because, of course, if there's one thing he wasn't, was a Republican. And, of course, he wasn't an anarchist either. Now, this mask that you see here is a bit of an adaptation, but it's drawn from V for Vendetta. Some of you will remember this film from 2005. It was, the film itself was based on a graphic novel by Alan Moore, and published between 1982 and 1989, and it was supposed to depict Britain in the aftermath of a fascist coup. Okay, so Alan Moore was really annoyed about the poll tax. Those of you of a certain age will remember that, and imagined what would the world look like had it been taken over by the fascist Tories. That was then turned into a film by the Wachowski sisters in 2005, who also produced The Matrix. And Alan Moore got so upset with the way that his film was being depicted that he withdrew from the production. He said it sacrificed class politics for identity politics. Now, what is the point of all of this? That's a good question, Alex. How did you get this to work? Let's try this one. No? Yes, okay, here we are. The point is, of course, that anarchy's meaning, the meaning of anarchism even, is deeply contested. It is no doubt true that most people have forgotten Guy Fawkes' original papism, that he fought on behalf of the Spanish Empire. But this is just the first iteration of a contested history of the concept of anarchy, of anti-establishment, of anti-statism, if you like, or this form of it. but it's also one marker in a plethora of popular culture markers for understanding anarchism. So I'm sure most of these are familiar to all of you. The Anarchist Cookbook. This is a depiction of the bomb that was thrown into a cafe in Paris, or is that the train station? I can't remember, one of the two. We've got, of course, The Secret Agent here, but then the more contemporary versions, Sons of Anarchy, huge TV series, and The Purge, a series of movies where once every couple of years, I can't remember, I've never seen it, basically you're allowed to go around killing as many people as you like, and apparently this is really, really cool. And V for Vendetta is the other. Okay? So essentially what these do is they show us that most people associate anarchism and anarchy essentially with some form of terrorism. Okay? And this has become a central motif in our popular culture. And I and Ruth and others have spent the last 20 years trying to debunk this view, hard as it may be, because there's a lot more to anarchism than this. I'm going to have to use this now. In fact, I argue, sorry, oh, I jumped the gun there. In fact, anarchism has a long and venerable history of constitutional political theory. And most people don't know about that, even people who write little children's books. I bought this for the kids years ago because it was pointed out to me that this is an anarchist kids book. I thought, I've got to get as many of those as I can. And I turned it, and on page 1, it said, the first rule of anarchy is, there are no rules. It made me so angry. I was livid. I was like, no. I mean, you know, it doesn't make sense in its own terms. The first rule of anarchy is there are no rules. You can't have it. That's tautological. Anyway, I tried to explain this to kids. They weren't listening. I was looking for the book this morning. I can't find it. I wonder where it is. I hope that hasn't been chucked out. But anyway, the point is, of course, that anarchists love rules. Okay? They love rules both because they criticize them continually and because they're constantly making new ones. Okay, so whether it's sort of structural rules of comportment, the ways in which we carry on with each other that generate structures of domination like patriarchy, white supremacy, these are the sorts of rules that anarchists hate. But anarchists also find that they're developing rules routinely. Okay, so whether this is like, we have to be pro-horizontalism. Okay, this is, all our social structures have to be flat. That's a rule. These don't have to be formal rules that are written down. Often they're norms that people they adopt, but more often than not, anarchists write these rules down too. David Graeber's got a wonderful little anecdote or a little example in his book, The Utopia of Rules, where he recounts that there's a famous child psychologist whose name I can't remember, who studied kids playing. And what they discovered was that children spend at least 50% of their playtime developing the rules of the game that they're going to play, and less, probably the same or less time actually playing the game. Now, what David Graeber takes from this, which I think is really profound and really quite true, it's not that the rules are getting in the way of playing. Developing rules can be playful too. And it's that he thinks that we see in the anarchist community. That we're constantly bickering with each other about the right way of doing X, Y, and Z. And we see this across society too. And that is part and parcel of enjoying life itself. It's not that rules are separate to our lives. They're a fundamental part of how we get by through our day, if you like. Okay? And I think that David Graeber didn't say very many things that are useful and interesting, and that actually, to be fair, that's not actually his observation. But still, I think it's a worthwhile one to continue with here. And I'm sorry, kids, from here on in, there's no more talking about kids stuff, okay? So, all right. What is anarchism if it's not what you think it is? Okay, so if it's not the purge, what is it? So very briefly, anarchy, the concept, comes from the Greek anarchos, which is without ruler or without sovereign, master, or lord. Okay? And Ruth and I redefine this slightly, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later on, as without a final or fixed point of authority. Okay? And that's broadly how we define the concept of anarchy. And anarchism, then, which I'm depicting here as using Peter Kropotkin's Mutual Aid, which is a phenomenal book, I recommend you all read it. Anarchism is that set of beliefs and principles that help you make sense of how one would go about living your life without a final point of authority. Okay. And the anarchists are the people that come up with those ideas. And those people can either be formal card-carrying anarchists, not that there are many of those, but imagine that anarchists carried cards, those are the sorts of people I'm talking about, but also those people that David Graeber calls a small a anarchist. People that sort of fellow travelers that would turn up to like Occupy Wall Street camps, or people that don't necessarily understand the intricacies of the anarchist ideology, but still try to play a role in propagating those sorts of anti-statist or anti-domination ideas. Sorry. This is Peter Kropotkin, cuddly old man. So, the opposite of anarchy, of course, is pretty much everything else, right? So every other political ideology has a fixed and final point of authority. So if you look at, taking this from Rancière, but Plato, for example, is a classic hater of democracy. And he associated democracy with anarchy. So in the sort of classic Greek sort of cosmology, political orders would rotate, they'd revolve and democracy was the solvent of politics that would destroy society and allow then the new aristoi, the new aristocracy to rise through the cycle. So the idea that then that the people would articulate their own voice was anathema to somebody who believed that philosophers like him should be the sort of anointed kings of that society. So, right from its very beginning, the concept of anarchy has been contested. One of the few things that anyone has ever done is ask about the anarchist constitutional tradition. Okay. All right, back to the 1990s. So Helen's very generously already opened this up for you. But this is me over there. And I was, as you can imagine, not most, but a lot of kids in those days were mad about Nirvana. This is a screenshot from Smells Like Teen Spirit. That's a circle A. You can't really see it. It's a terrible image. This is Keith from Prodigy. You've got the Rage Against the Machine, the Matrix, Chumbawamba. Incidentally, most of you don't know that these are anarchists. So Tub Thumping was what everyone called their sellout tune, but actually became the unofficial tune for, I can't remember, is it the Euros in, I can't remember, 96 possibly? And of course, Fight Club here, with its infamous final scene where the Twin Towers come crashing down because they've bought something like the Twin Towers, in this sort of radical anti-capitalist scene. So this was everywhere. But I had next to no understanding of what was going on. So I was at Nottingham Trent. I don't know if Lloyd Pettiford made it to the call today, but thanks to him, they kept me on at the end of the final year because I was having some difficulties, should we say. In that first year, I think I learned one thing. I can only remember learning one thing. It was Nana Poku, who is now the Pro-Vice-Chancellor and president of the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, was my political ideologies tutor at the time. And he explained to me that anarchism was an ideology that sort of foregrounded the sovereignty of the individual, mutual aid, equity, direct action, and a critique of the nation state and capitalism as those institutions which would suffocate that spirit of mutual aid amongst the peoples. And that really resonated with me. It's pretty much the only thing I remember from that first year at university. But I never thought I'd be an academic. I didn't think that this was, I'm not going to try to say, oh my God, and that was great waking. I did become woke. There's no question about that, okay? Woke from that moment onwards, no question. But this isn't where I decided, oh my God, I need to write a PhD in this. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. So I got a Tutu, or a Desmond, as they were known in those days. Everyone know the Desmonds, named after Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop of Cape Town. So my Desmond then took me nowhere. So I was thinking, right, what am I going to do? So I went travelling with my friends in Australia. My godmother Claire, who I think is on the call too, I was hoping she'd make it. Hopefully the early problems didn't knock everybody off. But she had been saving £10 a year for me from birth, and when I turned 21, that had matured to £700, all the money I had in the world, spent it on a flight off to Australia, and I was there then for the next 3 years. And during that period, so we're talking now 97 through to the millennium, things were hotting up internationally. Okay, this was a period where, well, essentially I applied to do a research master's at the University of Wollongong, so I wouldn't have to take any classes and I could hang out with my friends. Because if you do a talk master's, you have to turn up every week, okay? And I thought, a research master's, that's way better, because then I don't have to go to any classes. And for some reason, and I'm not quite sure why this happened, it's possible because Wollongong's a long way away from Sydney, and Sydney had a library of its own at the university. I started going to the University of Sydney Library. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's 9 floors above ground, 3 below, and I was absolutely enthralled by it. I mean, I couldn't believe that there were so many books. I think the Nottingham Trent's library was probably about the size of this room. And so I just started pulling books off shelves and I was writing this thing about post-structuralism and anarchism or anarchistic ideas. You know, everybody was writing about post-structuralism in those days, and it was broadly anti-statist and post-sovereign. And my die-hard Marxist supervisor, who was actually a China specialist, Steve Regler, he said, "Oh God, all this post-structuralism, it's just, honestly, it's rubbish, Alex. Why don't you just go and read some anarchism?" And I don't think he meant that as that wasn't supposed to be a good thing for me to do. This is like, you might as well be reading anarchism, which would be even worse, right? So I thought, oh God, that sounds awful, but also vaguely countercultural. So all of this is going on at the time, right? This is the Isla de Elena, the Zapatistas, who in 1994 rose up against the Mexican state in an armed but non-violent, I suppose, non-violent in the sense that there was no shooting involved. They established the autonomous region in the Chiapas, and that this was, I suppose, the first non-state nationalist uprising. And subsequent to this, of course, most nationalist uprisings are non-statist. Think of Rojava, the Balochistan at the moment. Most nationalist movements have turned away from state socialism as the modus operandi, and the Zapatistas were the first. Here, of course, we've got the Seattle protests in 1999. This is called the Battle of Seattle, where a huge coalition of green, environmental, labour groups came together to protest the iniquities of global capitalism, neoliberalism, the WTO, and so on. And, of course, there's Banksy. That went up in 1999. That's just around the corner from where we live in Bristol, isn't it, kids? Yeah. No, you don't know? No, damn it. Just point these things out. So the point is that when my supervisor said, go and read some anarchism, there was a good reason to do that. Now then, this is where it starts getting a little bit more intellectual, at least I hope it is. I'm going to try and use some more formal language. Anyway, well, anarchism was just so common. Everyone was doing it, right? It was everywhere. I think from about 1999 through to the next 5-7 years, some people were saying, towards the end of that period, Gabriel Kuhn and Matt Wilson, that this was going to be the anarchist century, right? This sort of post-sovereign, post-statist politics was everywhere, really. So the end of the history and last man, Francis Fukuyama famously argues that we're looking at the sort of common marketization of the West, that the EU was going to be the model for this post-statist polity that would emerge from there, and that liberalism had triumphed over fascism and communism, and those old ideological battles were dead, and liberalism had won. Hart and Negri, of course, disagreed, but agreed on some other points. They said, yes, liberalism has won, and essentially what's happened is that we've all become liberal consumers. Biopolitics has turned us all into the same sort of political subjects, not just in the West, but globally, and we're going beyond the state, and we've got a form of politics now that is networked and subterranean. And this sort of politics really galvanized, but also spoke to and echoed a whole bunch of things that were going on the streets. But I think the key book for me was Andrew Linklater's Transformation of Political Community. And the reason this is important is because this is probably the best example, I think, of a sort of critical theory, a Frankfurt School critical theory approach to this problem from within international relations. Andrew Linklater also became my first PhD supervisor at Aberystwyth. But essentially what he argued was that this post-statist moment invited us to think again about the anarchists who'd been unjustifiably sidelined. So bear in mind that all of this stuff had happened without anyone ever paying any attention to what the anarchists said about this, certainly not in the academy. And this is deeply ironic in a discipline like international relations, which is predicated on the concept of anarchy. So in international relations, we start from the position that the thing that we are studying is anarchic. That is, the international system, lacks a single sovereign power to which all others must then show fealty, genuflect, bow, and so on. That doesn't exist. So in the absence of a single world state, states by definition exist in a condition of anarchy. Now, this is a principle that was generated first in interwar years, then popularized by Kenneth Waltz from the 1950s onwards. Essentially galvanized an entire discipline. So the concept of anarchy, how do we find order, peace, justice in the absence of the state? Why don't you just ask the anarchists? But no. So this is what's really interesting about this, okay, is that Kenneth Waltz, who is without doubt the single most important person in our discipline in the post-war period, said in Man, the State and War that IR essentially redescribes, international relations, my discipline, redescribes world politics as the anarchist ideal of international relations. Now, he was very aware of what he was saying. Nobody else picked this up except Andrew Linklater. So Kenneth Waltz argued that the problem for international relations is this, and I quote, how to conceive of an order without an orderer and of organizational effects where formal organization is lacking. And Andrew Linklater had said, this is the moment we really need to be doing this. It was a footnote on page 196 of this book, but my God, for somebody like me who was trying to write a PhD on international relations, a footnote that let me into the discipline was better than there being absolutely nothing, okay? And that's essentially what I had to work with. And bless Andrew Linklater, because it was an amazing book too. So nobody seemed to know what the anarchists had written about international relations. So I went to Aberystwyth, I started the PhD, I said, I want to write about Proudhon. They said, what's Proudhon got to say about international relations? Isn't he just some sort of idealist who just wanted to smash houses and stuff? And I didn't quite say it like that, but I mean, that was essentially the gist of the argument. I mean, with the exception of Noam Chomsky, of course, who by this point was the most cited public intellectual in history after Michel Foucault, I think. Now, you've got Noam Chomsky, who is arguably the most significant public intellectual and critic of American foreign policy in history and the most cited individual on the planet, and yet nobody in international relations was engaging with the anarchists. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, this chap over here, also depicted here in a comic in 1848, I apologize. He had written 6 books on international relations. And these weren't pamphlets, and War and Peace, which we translated recently. You know, these are deep philosophical investigations into the nature of the post-Napoleonic secular European order. And they exist, but nobody seemed to know about them. Now, I was still writing my MA at this time when I found these books, and I was like, oh, wow, ka-ching, there's a PhD in this. So I instrumentally then applied to Aberystwyth and said, please will you accept me to do this PhD? And they said yes. Probably the stupidest thing I've ever done, because I had no idea what I was doing, absolutely no idea. Bless Andrew Linklater. He tolerated me for the entire time I was there. I went through a number of other PhD supervisors, as Helen's already told us, but he stayed with the project until I left. But what did Proudhon argue? Let me just check my timings here. We're running a little over time, as you know, but I've got about 15, 20 minutes left of this, unfortunately. Okay, so who was Proudhon? Proudhon argued that all property is theft. This is the depiction of him essentially going around smashing people's houses. So this is how they interpreted it in France at the time. Essentially what he argued was that all private property is theft. And the reason he argued that was because standard natural law accounts of the right to property were simply untenable, he argued. All property relations are essentially enabled by state force. The only reason you have title to something is because somebody else is willing to pull out their guns and defend that title. And that is the basic underlying feature of property relations. That doesn't make it wrong necessarily, but what he was trying to do with this was to demonstrate that those people that had property were doing it by taking it away from the commons. And the commons, he thought all the legitimate property was what he called usufruct, or trust. So all property should be held in trust, because you can't take it with you when you die, and so on. So the commercialization that came with property then, this was predicated on the state's defense of property title, which also enabled the state, of course, to tax people and to fund its wars, and so on and so forth. Proudhon wrote another 55 volumes of writings. Okay, so his complete works is far more extensive than Marx's, for example. And he wrote 6 books on international relations, this War and Peace being the most substantial, but he wrote a book on peace treaties of 1815. He wrote another one he wrote 2 on the Italian Risorgimento. He wrote another, oh God almighty, I'm going to go blank now. Oh, anyway, you get the idea. There was a lot of books. The problem was, for me at least, is that events outpaced me at Aberystwyth. So I was at Aberystwyth from 2001, which is when 9/11 took place, and then the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And all I was told was, Alex, you have to make Proudhon relevant. And this really grated with me. And I simply didn't have the language or the skills or the intellectual weapons to push back. And it made that time at Aberystwyth very difficult. Would I do this again? No. But Ruth and Dave advertised some PhD funding in 2004, and it changed my life. So I moved to Loughborough, jumped ship, and took up fully funded PhD at Loughborough, which was just a joy. And the reason it was a joy was because I had 2 supervisors who knew exactly what they were talking about. They didn't necessarily know the IR literature, but then most people who work in the history of political thought and philosophy tend not to care about what goes on in IR anyway. And I found this out very recently. When you grow up through the IR discipline, you tend to think that everybody cares about IR, and then you step outside and realise most people haven't a clue what goes on in there and don't really care. So anyway, but Ruth had written a book on William Morris, but also had this Anarchism, a Beginner's Guide, and was working really hard to sort of correct ideas about anarchism's origins and its basic principles. And Dave had written this wonderful book on the French anarchist movement, and I think is still writing a book on Guérin. Did that ever come out? I'd need to check, not yet. So, I mean, having that depth of understanding was crucial, but I think the key methodological difference was that I was able to say, I don't need to be relevant, and do that using Quentin Skinner, and saying that actually we can make the present look weird and strange by just showing the past as it was. And showing that and contrasting those 2 things unsettles what we take to be normal in the present conjuncture. And it's a much more modest claim, but it's much easier to realise as a PhD student. So, I mean, I can't tell you how thankful I am for that PhD funding. Of course, that was just the first phase, but anyway, thanks. I then got a PhD in 2008, by which time I was already teaching at the University of Bath, and then I got a postdoc there doing work on conflict, peace and conflict studies, which I'm trying to get back into at the moment. Then I got a postdoc in Bristol, as Helen's told you. LSE, I was a teaching fellow, and I was at Coventry for 3 months, which was a short but sweet period. And then I came to Exeter. And I put those words in Helen's mouth, but I can't tell you what an amazing thing it is to come to Exeter as somebody who wants to do theory properly. Just recently Ian Hampshire Monk has recently left us. We still have Dario and, of course, Rob and the whole team. You know, it's a phenomenal group of political theorists and it's pluralist in a way that allows you to just get on and do what you want to do, but understand the various limits of the choices that you make in a way that is quite uncommon, because often political theory departments expect you to pursue your craft in one particular way. And being at Exeter has just been, it's just been amazing. It really has. And so what I did was I published the book eventually. And of course, because we'd had to do all of this underlabouring work to try and show people that anarchism isn't what you think it is, I also wrote one of these corrections, and I'm very proud of that. And then, of course, we started this work on anarchist constitutional politics. Now, just to sort of set the scene, pretty much up until the turn of the millennium, most people thought anarchism emerged out of a confluence of Marxism and liberalism. It took Marx's conception of class conflict and capitalism and conjoined it with a sort of a liberal idea of the individual, and that's where you get anarchism from, which is totally anachronistic, okay? It is because anarchism predates both of those things. In fact, John Stuart Mill took his idea of individual sovereignty from Josiah Warren. He wanted Proudhon dead because he hated everything he stood for. And of course, Marx thought that Proudhon's What is Property was one of the first scientific accounts of the emergence of capitalism. So there had to be something else going on in terms of origin stories. And I hadn't done very much of this in the book. Right? So the book was much more about international politics, dealing with these things at a sort of high level of abstraction. I didn't really do the job I would like to have done in terms of the history of political thought. So it's the best book I could have written at the time, but I would like to have written a better book. I think I probably could today. But the thing that I noticed was that in the political theory circles that I started mixing in here, but also at the LSE before I arrived, everyone was talking about Philip Pettit's theory of republicanism and this notion of non-domination and the Republican tradition as being a central element or a new way of thinking about freedom today. And I asked, wow, that's interesting. I wonder how I can jump on that bandwagon. And I thought about this concept of domination and non-domination. I thought, my goodness, anarchists use that language too. And then I remembered Stephen Vincent's book about Proudhon, which locates him as one of the progenitors of Republican socialism from 1848. And I thought, I should have done more on this Republican theme. And I thought, this was the second ka-ching moment, right? So I had my ka-ching with the PhD, and this was my second ka-ching. This time I thought, do you know what, I'm just going to go straight to Ruth. So I emailed Ruth and I said, have you ever thought about anarchism and republicanism before? She goes, yeah. I was like, oh. And then have you ever thought about writing anything? She said, I've written little bits, I'm not much. I was like, what about like non-domination? And this, I'm making this conversation up, obviously, because it probably was only one email. And so we decided that we would pursue this project of recovering anarchism's Republican heritage. And what that allowed us to do, almost immediately, was reframe pretty much everything we'd read. I hope I'm not going OTT on this one. But when you look at anarchism as an outgrowth of the Republican tradition, you immediately see a tradition that is challenging power, balancing powers, dividing powers, and finding ways of building new forms of political order without a final point of authority, which, of course, Republicans are doing too by getting rid of the divine right for kings and trying to locate power in the people, the constituent power. And the anarchists did exactly the same, just disagreed on how you ought to do it. And so we've spent then the last few years trying to figure out how they did it. When I got to Exeter, one of the first things that they said to me was, you've got to get a research grant. I was like, no! Do you remember this? Oh, my God, the amount of complaining I did. Where's Brian? Sorry, Brian. I went to the union. I mean, this was just outrageous. Like, no one's going to give me a grant. I do anarchism. Nobody funds anarchism. And then I got one grant. And then I got another grant. And Ruth and I have had 4 very substantial grants to do this work on anarchist Republican politics, which was slightly galling given the complaining I'd done. Yeah, but I also became very active in the UCU afterwards, so thank you, Brian, for that support. Okay, nearly there. Okay, so for the remainder of this talk, 10 minutes, 15 at the most. I want to talk about the book that Ruth and I have just finished. I printed it off yesterday. It's a weighty tome. I mean, actually weighs a lot. Who knows if it's got any actual intellectual weight. And it's already been sent back to Cambridge, so hopefully this will be out by next summer. I just got a couple of pictures up here. I'm still looking for a cover image, Ruth. I wonder if you like either of these. So this is the toppling of the Vendôme column during the Paris Commune in 1871. And the Vendôme column was commemorating the Battle of Austerlitz, has a statue of Napoleon at the top of it. And during the Paris Commune, they pulled it down. This was a protest against the French Empire. And of course, the one underneath it, this is the toppling of Edward Colston in 2002. 1922 in Bristol, and I just wanted to say that there's a strong continuity. Now, this doesn't really depict what we're showing in the book, of course, because what we're not trying to do is defend a sort of a solvent anarchism. We're not looking to sort of defend a critique. We're trying to show the positive reconstruction that occurs alongside or drives forward that critique. So the book is essentially a case study of anarchist constitutionalizing. It has 4 main arguments. The first is a standard anarchist argument, I suppose, that the nation state and capitalism are structures of arbitrary domination. The second is that anarchy is a viable constitutional principle, or Hans Kelsen would have called a Grundnorm. The third is that anarchists constitutionalize routinely, so the second half of the book is broadly empirical, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And of course, this is a deeply practical book. It learns from the experiences of anarchists in the IWW, or Labour Union, Occupy Wall Street, or Decolonise Oakland, street politics, and in Radical Roots. And I'll talk about them in a minute, because they're the only success story that we have in the book. But essentially, it's a bottom-up politics for us all. So, oops, what's happened here? Oh, damn it. Okay, anyway. This is the frontispiece for Hobbes' Leviathan. Many of you may know it, recognise it already. I just want to point out, so essentially the standard conception of the state is that the state is an aggregation of individuals, and it's represented in the figure of the sovereign, who is, in Hobbes' terms, an artificial person. Okay? So all the people here, these are all little people inside the king, and the king is the sovereign, and he represents the people. Okay? In broad terms. Now, essentially, this model of politics is not the standard. Everyone uses this as a foil. I mean, we could go through the history of modern political thought to explain how that's taken place, of course, but pretty much everyone's got something to say about this. The two that we want to speak to, so what the book does is it engages with lots of literatures in contemporary constitutional theory, but 2 that are of note today. One is societal constitutionalism, and the other is global constitutionalism. Societal constitutionalism is a body of theory developed out of Germany by a guy called Günther Teubner, and Teubner argues that this sort of model of politics is essentially fascistic. He argues that the state is not the only group. And as societies develop, and as the division of labour becomes more and more modernised, if you like, as societies become more plural, divide off, and then interlink through complex ways, actually what you see is that every group that emerges constitutes itself as a public body. Public in a sort of with a small p. Okay, whether these are industries, towns, family groups, churches, I'm going to say football groups, all of the others. These are all groups that emerge through the development and the creation of modern society. And he says that if we try and aggregate those groups and represent them with one, that is the path to fascism. And I think he had a front row seat, so he probably knows what he's talking about. And so what he argues is that, and he doesn't use the language, but we're saying that actually this is a way of thinking about how we can theorize anarchy in new ways and what we might constitutionalize, because what we're constitutionalizing is radical pluralism, social pluralism. An argument, of course, that was developed by the pluralists, Harold Lasky and others, but of course they all borrowed from Proudhon anyway. But Günther Teubner is a really interesting character. The second is the global constitutionalism literature. So Teubner's looking at state development or communal development. The global constitutionalism literature takes a global view. And they argue that with the spread of liberal constitutional values like the rule of law, human rights, democracy, and so on, what you're seeing here, and this is something that they argue whether this is a good or a bad thing, is the transnationalization of a European constitutional tradition. And this constitutional process is bad in the sense that it's neo-colonial, because it's imposing on other people principles that were developed in Europe. But it might also be good because what it's doing is it's showing that there are ways in which we can constitutionalize or think about constitutional politics without the state. And it challenges us then to think about, so how do you find justice and order in anarchy, which was the title of my other book, by the way. Little plug. Okay, so there's 2 traditions here then. One that's seeing the pluralization of society as being antithetical perhaps to a single point of sovereign authority, and a second which sees the global unfurling of a constitutional movement that is taking place without sovereignty. So both of these two things are empirical claims about the world that demand that we think again about constitutions. And I think this is where we get involved because, like the anarchists, essentially what they're saying is that there is no final point of authority. Okay? Well, Kelsen famously argues, of course, that international law is predicated on treaty law. Treaty law is only established by states agreeing not to go to war with one another. And as soon as they do, of course, all bets are off. So the point here, of course, is that international relations is probably prior. I'm going off topic here. Okay, right, I'm going to stop there because that's just going to get... But let me. What do I mean? What is a constitution? So Dario's done a lot of work on this. Don't get upset, please. So you could think of a constitution in standard ways as essentially defining who gets to take choices, under which conditions, and the rules that constrain that person, usually. Okay? We don't think that that's good enough. Because if you read through the anarchist literature and meld it with some of this new constitutional literature, you see, and actually we take a lot of this from Dario's piece in political theory. Coming a bit late, I might just leave that. If you think about the Constitution in more capacious terms, what you see actually is that all constitutions confront and challenge power, and then they divide power. Okay? So at its very root, constitutions do something like maintain the European balance of power. Because this is the standard argument about treaty law. Without treaty law, constitutions are on very shaky ground. Okay? Because establishing a balance of power amongst nations is the prerequisite for enabling or allowing or having domestic law. Because if you're at war, of course, all bets are off. Okay? But states are not the only groups. So what we're arguing in the book is that constitutions look to establish regular relations between a whole plurality of groups. Okay, just like the United Nations, for example, 194 states there. The United Nations is an unofficial, non-sovereign constitution developed through treaty law that establishes regular relations between states. But constitutions also have declarations that define we the people against you are not the people. Okay, and that's perfectly normal because if I support Liverpool Football Club and I'm a paid up member of that group, I don't want Man United fans in. Okay, it's just, you might think that sounds prejudicial, but you're obviously not Liverpool fans. Okay? And the point is that this is perfectly normal because I'm also a member of a whole bunch of other groups and they might have Man United fans in them. But when it comes to my allegiance to Liverpool Football Club, I would like that to be full of Liverpool fans. And I will mix and get on with the Man United fans in all the other groups that I'm involved with. Or I might have split loyalties. But the fact of the matter is that constitutions overlap. And this constitutional pluralism is a fact of life. People like Martin Lachlan and others get very upset about this, but it's true. And the question that anarchists pose is, why do you have to try and fix that with a sovereign authority? Why can't we find a way to balance those powers and to constitutionalize them in ways that allows us, or that to change, without needing a single sovereign authority? The thing you do to make that happen are the rules and laws that we develop. Okay, so constitutions have all of these rules and laws, and they're plural and they often clash, and you need highly trained lawyers to actually determine which rules apply in this case and which don't, and what the full legal authority or scope of that law is. Okay, so that's part of what laws do. Okay, and all constitutions have that. And of course, constitutions have decision-making procedures. Okay? And democracy, or articulating the voice of the demos, doesn't have one form. It's not just majoritarian democracy. We know that. Okay? So articulating the voice of the majority, of the demos, can be done in a number of ways. Majoritarianism, consensus, through social capital and habit. I mean, there's just a million different ways in which you can come to collective agreements. Point is, anarchists do all of this routinely. Okay? So anarchists do this all the time. And in the book, and this is where I'm going to end, 2 minutes on this, because then you actually go and buy the book because you'll be so excited and interested. So the first half of the book looks at the political theory of anarchist constitutional politics from about the 1840s through to the turn of the 20th century, and then 3 chapters take a more empirical, if you like, approach. And we worked really closely with 2 groups, with Radical Roots and with the IWW. The IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, a revolutionary syndicalist or revolutionary socialist labour union. Industrial Workers Union, I can bore you to tears with the details, and Radical Roots have been decommodifying property for the last 30 years. So they have been taking property out of the housing market by turning them into trusts. They have been then taking workplaces out of the market by turning those into workers' cooperatives, and they've been doing that for 30 years. So if you want to see a success story for modern anti-capitalism, Radical Roots, for my money, is probably the best thing you're going to find. And they've done this completely under the radar and with huge success and with no plaudits. And I think they deserve a massive round of applause. Hold it. Radical Roots describe themselves, this is a gathering here, they describe themselves as a bank that meets 4 times a year in a field. And essentially what they do is they give loans to people to set up worker and housing cooperatives on the agreement that they then form them as par value mutualist trusts or co-ops, which essentially takes them out of the housing market or the work out and makes all work essentially cooperative. Okay? So these are decommodifying capitalism through their daily actions. And what we did is we worked with them to try and understand how they came to new agreements and how they went through their constitutional renewal process, which, and we've got lots to say about that, but they're an amazing group. The second group here we look at is Decolonise Oakland. And one of the chapters is a critique of democracy in radical movements, this idea that you can somehow appeal to democracy and somehow you'll find the way to a radical politics. And we argue that democracy is a false promise, that actually and if you look at what happened in Oakland, what the anarchists did in Occupy Wall Street was they established consensus decision-making as the standard way to get to agreement. That meant we all had to agree before anything passed. They then dialed that down and said, we'll have supermajorities. So in order for anything to change, you need to get at least 2/3 of everybody on board. And this is better, they argued, because then you don't have 49% of the demos who are upset. Now, the problem with that is it's deeply conservative. And this came to the fore in Oakland at the end of 2011, beginning of 2012, when there was a proposal to decolonize the Occupy movement, that the Occupy Wall Street was deeply problematic, given that the whole thing was taking place on occupied and unceded indigenous lands. And so they proposed to Occupy Oakland that they would change the constitution, if you like, the informal constitution of the Oakland occupation, in order to recognize this fact. And it met significant opposition because it was argued that indigenous rights were not our primary concern, the usual arguments you get from right on workerist politics. Everything is about the workplace, okay, so the Marxist triumph. The interesting thing is that because it demanded a supermajority of something like, I can't remember exactly, 66% or higher, they couldn't get the votes to pass it. So you have one of the most radical movements in the Occupy movement, Occupy Oakland, was unable to reconstitute itself because it hadn't considered the centrality of democracy that had been established in Wall Street earlier that year and had essentially structured the Occupy movement in ways that couldn't be changed. And so what we do is we trace and we tell a story about how this is a failure. And the final group is the IWW. And then the IWW, the argument we make in that chapter is we look at the ways in which a sort of a workerist politics, where class struggle first, everything else second, essentially shapes the way in which the IWW can do anything. So IWW is a radical union, and its preamble is sort of this beautiful piece of poetry that closes with the line, and the workers will build the new in the shell of the old. And that is, this is written in 1905. It's an iconic line in working class or anarchist politics today. And this prefigurative politics, in principle, ought to enable all sorts of ways of changing the world without taking power. But ironically, or depressingly, what we see in the IWW is that a workerist politics trumps gender politics, environmental politics. So the only amendment to the IWW's preamble in 120 years was to add "and live in harmony with the earth" at the end of a line somewhere about 2/3 down the preamble. There's been no attempt to reconstitute by rethinking the fundamental values at the heart of the IWW as an institution. And this is a real problem because most of the people in the IWW are anarchists. And they have an intersectional politics, which means that they are really attuned to the ways in which gender, sexuality, the environment intersect with labour, problems of labour. And yet, in spite of this, because of their adherence or their fidelity to the preamble and this working class politics, they have been unable to realise the sort of radical politics that is immanent within that institution, but held back by its own constitution. So the book then tries to take some lessons for contemporary politics from those cases. So, conclusion. I had a lot more going on this slide, but this is the wrong one. Maybe it's this one instead. So, 4 things for you to think about while you go and watch the fireworks later. Life is anarchic. And this is one of the central arguments in chapter 3 of the book. There is no final point of authority. So I had, there is just no natural way in which anything emerges. Even the laws of nature change from the first moment of the Big Bang to a few moments later. Everything changes, always. Life is anarchic. The second thing I'd like you to remember is that anarchism is central to our political and cultural imagination, and we just don't see it. And so when you look at the guy being burnt, or whatever it is that gets burnt, whichever effigy we use, think about the ways in which those tropes and those ideas are flowing and percolating through our cultural imagination. The last thing, the third thing I want you to remember is that anarchists constitutionalize routinely, and just as everyone else does. We all do this. And the question we ought to be going away with and thinking about is how we can use that anarchist experimentation to help everybody do this in ways that enables us to have a little less kowtow to the whichever sovereign overlord would like to dominate us tomorrow. So I think the anarchist politics has something for us all. I'd just like to say thank you very much again to Helen for her wonderful opening remarks. Thank you very much to Dad, to Anna and the kids for coming. Oh, it's so great, thank you. Lucia had to sacrifice a drama practice this afternoon, everybody. This is a massive sacrifice for her. So pleased that she's made it without getting really angry. Sorry. And thank you all very much for coming. I'm done.
I'm Alex's head of department, Rob. I'm going to say a few words to close the ceremony, very brief words of tribute to Alex. The very brief version is, Alex, we think you are wonderful. Yes, your dad is a great colleague. I served on Alex's appointment panel for his job back in 2012, one of the easiest appointments we've ever made. His infectious exuberance was plain to see and really won us over as a panel, and we've been so overwhelmed by his impressive scholarship, his inspirational teaching, and just the fact that he's such a splendid colleague. And it's such a pleasure to listen to him this evening. And we're so lucky that your peripatetic academic journey has ended at Exeter, and we're so... Well,
Oh, God. Sorry, sorry.
No more jobs. Stuck with us. So thanks so much, Alex. Congratulations on your achievement, and let's go and toast his success. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.